Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third session of this year's GATCO BALPA Controller Pilot Symposium. Today is the Controller Pilot Information Exchange. This has been a really popular seminar in the past. It's a chance to get questions in for pilots if you're a controller, or controllers if you're a pilot, and get some feedback from the other side of the microphone. Previous sessions that we've had last week and the week before, we looked at contrail management and how this could reduce aviation's impact on global warming. We also discussed last week the positive traits and skills that pilots and controllers utilise every day, which help to keep us all safe. Plan for today's session: very shortly, I'm going to introduce our panellists and then let them tell you a little bit more about themselves. And we have a few questions in the bank already to get the ball rolling. But if you have any questions you want to ask them, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen. That gives us the questions that we can then give to the panelists. Chat function, if it's available, you can use that amongst yourselves, but we cannot see what you're typing. So if you want to ask questions, please keep them to the Q&A box. Make sure that your microphones are all muted, your cameras are off, and just to let you know that this session is being recorded as the previous ones were, and they will all be available to watch in the future. So if you have to leave early, if you come late, if you've missed last week's session, then you can get them all online at a later date. We'll update you on our social media accounts. So this year's panellists, we have Andy Thompson, who is a London area controller. We have Glenn Morian, who's a Heathrow-based captain on the A320 fleet and BALPA rep. We have Mark Robertson, who is Thames Radar, Heathrow Special VFR and Gatwick approach controller. We have Emma Henderson, who is also a captain on the Airbus 320 fleet and the CEO of Project Wingman, which gives support to frontline medical staff. And myself, my name's Olivia May. I'm a tower controller at Luton Airport. So lots of experience with A320 types, not so much with the bigger planes, but if you have tower questions, I will do my best. So I'd like to ask Andy Thompson to start by introducing himself a bit more fully.
Hi, good morning. Andy Thompson. I'm an honorary controller at London, and I do the Clacton, Daventry and Brecon sectors. So when you're coming in from Maastricht, or if you're coming in from Shannon, or you're heading north or southbound up the sort of centre of the country, that's kind of my airspace, basically.
Thank you. Glenn, can you introduce yourself a bit more?
Yeah, hi, Glenn Morian. So British Airways A320 captain at the moment, previously 777s and companies before on Embraers 73s-8s ATRs, flying instructing in the US and in the UK, and bits of regional flying as well.
Thank you. Mark.
Hi, I'm a Gatwick controller initially, and then London City, Thames Radar and Heathrow Special VFR. Before that, I was at a light aircraft airport, had a PPL, and I instructed gliding.
Thank you. And Emma.
Hello, I'm a former EasyJet captain. I took redundancy, or retiremency as I'm now calling it, during the pandemic. And I was based actually at Stansted, then Luton, and then Gatwick. So I've probably spoken to all of you in the past. I was previously an instructor at Wickham, so again, probably, and then up here in the north of Scotland where I live. And my flying career started on a University Air Squadron about 1,000 years ago. So it was sort of started with military flying and then moved after a bit of a gap for family to commercial flying here. But I actually did my licenses in New Zealand. So the differences between ATC there and here are vast. So when I took redundancy, I set up a charity called Project Wingman, as Olivia said, and we used 6,500 aircrew volunteers across the country to provide wellbeing support to frontline NHS staff, and the charity is still running. I'm the CEO of that now, and that was what I was awarded my MBE for back in 2021.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, so to start the session off, we've got an introductory question. Very general. how much awareness do you think there is amongst your communities of what the other side's role involves? I'm going to come to the controllers first. Controllers, how much awareness do you think we have as a collective of what a pilot's job involves?
I think there's a fair awareness in, you can tell almost if a crew's experience and therefore have awareness, or if it's a younger crew and they are popular to their aircraft. There's some communications we get that are, pilots are so aware of what's going on around. And I think that there's a lot of ways of getting that information, that education. Certainly the other way around, we try and teach the workload in the cockpit versus our requirement to talk to pilots.
Andy, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so from an area point of view, I mean, we used to do all sorts of things before I joined the company. You'd go on these BA days where you'd go on the flight deck, things like that, or would go down as truce. You could go on the simulators, but it seems to be less and less now. And obviously with the pandemic, we've had less visitors in the ops room, but hopefully that's going to start changing over time now. So the pilots can come and sit with us again. That would be good. Yeah, I would say as a result of the pandemic, there seems to be less of it, you know, especially as a lot of new trainees come through. They've not been on a flight deck. Some of them haven't been on a flight deck before, so they don't always get an appreciation of what actually goes on.
I'd be inclined to agree with that, actually. Sorry to jump in, but I think, yeah, when I started flying as an instructor, actually, there was a tower at High Wycombe that we were able to go up into. So that was an introduction for us to see what happens when you've got 9 light aircraft in a small circuit. But also when I was at Stansted, it was we would get quite a lot of airport standbys that wouldn't turn into flights. And they were very, very happy for you to go up into the tower and visit them. And the same, you know, at Luton and even Gatwick as well. But I just think, I don't know if it's because I became busier, but I think the way that airlines have changed, the way they run things as well, there's less opportunity to do that in your working day. So although the invitation's always there, having the time to go up and have a look is eroded. And I think that's a real shame, because I think you learn an awful lot from going and spending even like half an hour in a tower.
You know, just to follow on from Emma's point, really, possibly as a follow-on from COVID, maybe this is the way we're heading anyway. It seems that most airlines really just in terms of managing costs, don't really program these exchange opportunities into training, and so the general sense amongst the community is lost. As Mark was saying, obviously an experienced crew will sort of exude that sort of awareness of what's going on the other side of the radio that an inexperienced crew probably would not. But certainly for airlines or for operators that are flying transnationally or internationally, there's also an awareness that ATC will have differing procedures, differing levels of sophistication in terms of equipment, and different levels of busyness in different sectors. And so it's almost more relevant to intuit how busy you think they are on the other side of the radio line, simply by the tone, by the speed of speech, rather than having some sort of granular understanding of the internal processes, which vary so much between areas that are non-radar facilities in certain countries, and obviously a sophisticated sector like we would have in the London area, or places like New York or Singapore for that example.
A few of you have mentioned the COVID pandemic. How do you think that's affected these kind of things? So whereas you were saying before, Emma, you could come up and visit the tower in Luton, I think that started back up now, but for a long time nobody was allowed to visit the tower, nobody was allowed to go on fan flights, it was all very much distanced. Do you think that's affected our understanding? Has it set us back in the process?
I think it's probably affected the younger, the newer pilots coming into the industry more, because those of us who have done that before have been very aware of we're still aware of what's been going on. And particularly when you become a captain, you make it your business to make sure you know how other parts of the industry work. It actually matters that you know how the ground handling works and how air traffic works, because all of that affects your day. So whereas the younger pilots coming into the industry haven't had those opportunities, and I think the transition to a bit more digital control that's happened kind of at the same time means that you don't have the I wouldn't say you build up a relationship with controllers, but if you're flying out of Luton all the time, you get to know voices, and you get to know, you actually get to know, if you get that voice, you go, yeah, well, they're going to give me a shortcut, or they're going to put me in the hold or something. And you do kind of get to have a bit more of an understanding of how things are going to happen. And of course, as soon as you get into data link territory, which is obviously not in the terminal areas, you don't have that kind of voice relationship, so it all becomes so automated that I just wonder if there's less interest from the younger pilot. This may not be the case, but I think some of the younger pilots I used to fly with would sort of say, oh really, why would you want to go and do that? Why would you want to go and find anything out about that? Or they'd get frustrated because they wouldn't get the answer that they wanted, and you'd sort of think, and you'd explain to them, do you realize that this is also happening? And there's just slightly less awareness, I think, potentially, and I've probably just lost the interest of all your younger viewers by saying that, and it's by no means something that I'm being critical of, but I do think it's something that definitely the pandemic's affected it, and anyone who's come into the industry in the last 3 years should definitely make it their business to go up into a tower or go on a visit to Swanwick if they get the opportunity, just to see how the people who we feel keep us safe when we come back into UK airspace are actually operating, when we're trying to do our jobs as well.
What do the controllers think? What's the perspective in Swanwick?
I've always found it fascinating being able to talk directly with pilots to find out just silly little things. Recently, on the last time I had a training session where there was a pilot there, the pilot said, in an emergency situation where we've lost an engine, one of the things we have to do is restrict our TCAS capability. Well, yeah. For us, that's really important, but to just learn that one little thing from a chat with a pilot I now tell that to all my students. And I think that's really important, that we find those little things that almost throwaway comments that are actually quite crucial in times when things are busy or awkward or unusual.
Yeah, definitely. That would be, I can understand why would you know that if you haven't learned that procedure, but also why shouldn't you know? Yeah, I think that's really important for you to know, because the reason it's restricted is so that in the middle of dealing with an emergency, you're not going to get a TCAS resolution advisory. So, you haven't got all that extra work going on that you don't need to, you become the priority, obviously, but why would you know that? But also, yeah, you definitely should know stuff like that. There's probably lots of little tidbits. I suppose the fan flights probably would really help with that as well, wouldn't they? Because then you see things like that.
I think following up on what Mark and Emma have said, Mark, in that example, just for the type specific performance, you may not be able to comply with the resolution advisory anyway, which is why the type specific SOP requires essentially downgrading the in-aircraft response to traffic advisory only. But in terms of throwaway comments and what Emma was saying about new generations coming into the profession, I mean, one thing I would certainly advocate is just speaking up for what you want. I think it's too easy to think that the range of things you're allowed to say must be scripted, and that you just can't come up with a request that suits you. And so I would say to first officers, if you want to request something, just request it. If the answer is no, on your end, or Olivia's, Andy's, you'll explain why, time permitting, and then our experience base grows. But if you don't want to ask for the turn or the climb or whatever else you think you need that suits, we think we need that suits us, then you don't know what you don't know until you ask the question. And so again, that can be a very cultural in what we assume we're allowed to say and not. You know, you get the Americans, for instance, who have no problem asking for whatever it is they think they need, and it may be appropriate, it may not, based on workload at the time. But we can't find the balance unless you actually just ask the question in the live environment. So.
And talking as a normal person as well. I think if you've gone through if you've gone through an MPL course or an integrated course, and it's drilled into you that you can only speak to air traffic control in a certain way and using certain language, it's a bit of a revelation for some people when they get into an aircraft and find out they're allowed to actually say normal words to air traffic controllers and nothing bad will happen. And sometimes that's what you need to do, because there isn't an RT speak for, I need a horseshoe shaped sort of descent so that I can get down through this cloud or something like, or around these cells or something. Sometimes you just have to say it in normal language. So, and that's all completely okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and just remembering that it's people at the other end, not just voices. Yeah.
A lot of the work that we do when we invite the pilots up to the tower is just trying to get them to see us as humans and not scary robots. That leads me into the next question that we have, which is, in what ways do you consider the other side's problems already, and how much does it influence your decision making? So, for example, when you go to ask that question, is it just I'm not sure if I can ask this, or is there part of a consideration of the other side's workload when you do or don't ask that question?
Definitely, I would say that if it's a busy, you listen out, don't you? If it's a really busy day and the thing you're going to ask is like something that would be nice to have and not need to have, then actually you just sack it off and think, the controller just does not need me asking this question now just because it's going to shave 3 minutes off my arrival time in Sharm el Sheikh or somewhere, So I think it just comes down to a bit of self-awareness and awareness of what's going on around you. But on a quiet day, absolutely, I've asked for and been given direct routings to all the way up to Bonner Bridge in Inverness before, because there's nothing else going on, and and it's New Year or something. So I think it's just you do need to be aware of what's going on. And the other thing is, I think also I've always tried to explain to first officers, particularly as part of my kind of training for them, just listen out to what they're saying as well. It's not just how much chat there is, it's also whether that chat is about the fact that somebody's been put onto a medical emergency or a technical diversion or something like that. If you're trying to manage multiple go-arounds or something like that, that's not the time to be asking if we could get a shortcut or something.
Just to follow up on Emma, I think the opposite side of that would be sharing a piece of information that hasn't been requested that is actually relevant to the controller as well as to other aircraft. So you may be at the front of a stream of aircraft and there's an area of hazardous weather that we know you may not see on your equipment. That's relevant not only for our deviation and why we're asking for it, but to raise awareness for the crews in trail behind us. And so just giving an air rep or a PI rep on that picture facilitates your understanding what's coming next, thinking
and
ahead.
Icing particularly with
and
that,
icing particularly, which is one that in larger aircraft we think, oh, it's just some icing, but this could be literally saving someone's life in a smaller aircraft, because the controller can then pass that information onward, as well as you're anticipating that descents would be affected, for instance, because a range of aircraft are running their icing services if your level of situational awareness is there. So the air rep becomes not just taking up time on the radio, but something that benefits controllers, other aircraft in trail, and particularly general aviation aircraft that may be more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And the other side of the radio, Andy, Mark, what kind of thoughts do you have on that when you're making decisions for aircraft? Do you have the pilot's workload in mind, and how does that affect the decisions that you make?
Okay, so when we're busy, if there's no issues raised, I would tend towards my priorities. But as soon as an issue is reported, that becomes balanced, and then if that becomes an urgency or an emergency, then yeah, absolutely consider workload on the cockpit of that aircraft, and then try and manage that by either splitting the sector and giving them a frequency on their own, and we can do that both ways. We can put all the aircraft we've got onto another frequency, so they don't have to change frequency themselves, or if it's just an urgency rather than an emergency, get them to transfer to a frequency. And then just, consider how much more workload there is in those scenarios. But if we are busy and there's nothing untoward, then I would expect my decisions to be the prioritization in that.
Andy, anything to add?
I'd kind of echo what Mark says. I think from an en route point of view, we generally just work around what we get told. I mean, we give level by restrictions sometimes in the climb, which sometimes aren't or not always realistic, like especially stuff going northbound to Daventry in order to jump Prestwick Centre's airspace. We sometimes tell aircraft to be level a beam Trent, and if you pick the wrong aircraft, like especially the BA 787s, they seem to have incredible D rates on their engines, so their climb performance is dreadful. And some people just, you're busy, like Mark was saying, you just give it the arbitrary level by restriction, and then it's not until a few minutes later that you get told, oh, we're going to struggle to make that. But if we just get told straight away, like we can make, don't mean like people need to learn the sort of airspace, but if we can sort of know beforehand roughly what level can be achieved, or as soon as possible, if it's going to be a struggle, things like that, we can work around that. The sooner we know about it, the sooner we can quickly work around it. But otherwise, like I said, any instructions we give, such as weather, just tell us you can't do it, aircraft performance reasons, whatever it is, and we'll change our plan. We'll work around it.
Yeah, from a tower perspective, it's so important to know for the first aircraft, as Glenn was saying, if they can or cannot fly the SID standard, because if the first aircraft can't, then it's likely that all the rest that are in the queue behind are not going to be able to either. And that gives us the ability to phone up and making a coordination with our approach radar and with London Control Centre and make a general plan. So we can quite often get a blanket. If they can make a right turn and go to the north, then we can give them any range between these headings and these altitudes. If they need to go south, it has to be one-by-one coordination. And so we know our workload is going to increase. And that also has a knock-on effect of how fast the ground controller is pushing and taxiing out aircraft. If you've got a queue of 12 planes at the hold, it's not good for pilot well-being, passenger well-being, the environment, the congestion of the taxiways. Nobody wants a massive queue of aircraft, so we can slow things down. So it's good information all round. Leads into the next question, which is, what do you think could be done? Either the big sort of, what could they do? Or more specifically, what can we ourselves do to improve that awareness?
I think more of a window into each other's worlds as part of training, to be honest with you. So when you go through, I don't think it happens when you join an airline as first officer, but certainly when you go through command training, you have a day where, at EasyJet, you have a day where you spend a day in a hangar. So you go and meet the ops team and you meet the maintenance team, and you just get to know other bits of the business that you're going to be talking to as part of your day. And I think that should include a visit to the tower. It's not going to give you a window into what happens in Swanwick, but there are opportunities to visit Swanwick, and I just think from a pilot point of view it would be really helpful for things like that, and actually being able to share things with you, like Mark said about the TCAS restriction. It's the same with if we declare an emergency. Initially all you get is that we're declaring an emergency, so you don't know if that's a medical emergency, which means the aircraft's still operating completely normally and we can fly it in a completely normal way, or if that's a dual hydraulics failure that means that we can't and our workload in the flight deck goes up exponentially with something like that than it does with a sick passenger. Is obviously an emergency, but not for the pilots as such, other than that we've got to land quickly. but the aircraft still can do everything. So just knowing things like that is the sorts of conversations you're able to have when people meet together. I think more of that needs to happen, particularly as we go to a more automated way of operating.
Absolutely. I mean, from the tower perspective, I would say that Luton definitely, and I'm 99% sure that almost every tower in the UK is the same. If you're a pilot based out of that airport, if you get in touch with the tower, they'd be more than happy to have you come up, visit. It can be a formal thing, it can be an informal visit. We offer the opportunity for pilots to plug in if it's quiet and we've got the staff to do it. I'm sure all the towers in the UK are the same, and Prestwick Centre, the same as Swanwick, they will offer the opportunity for pilots to visit as well, see how it works. What do you think, Andy and Mark, from the controller point of view? How can we improve awareness of what's going on inside the cockpit?
I think bringing back fan flights. I know the problem at the moment is cost, because even though we go down as a crew member, we have to pay tax and charges for insurance purposes. So the company won't provide any expenses because we still have to pay, you know, whatever the passenger duty is for the day, because it's the only way we can get through security without having airside. So that is probably a big stumbling block for the area controllers, as we literally can't get airside, and it becomes a cost. And obviously at the moment we lost out a lot of money with the pandemic, and they don't really have money to throw at these things. So at the moment it's going to be a bit of an issue, I would imagine, for a couple of years until they decide it's relevant for us, so it's useful for us. But obviously simulator, things like that, there are people that are interested in doing that type of thing. I think that's, personally, I found that quite useful. But yeah, that's from an en route point of view.
Yeah, I think that perhaps earlier in our training, there's becoming a lack of understanding or training in what the pilots are doing. When I went through the college, I'm not sure what it was when Andy went through college, I did 15 hours flying. I did 2 weeks at British Airways, learning, just being shown their ground operations and the complexities that bring. And I think even just a 1 hour fan flight would demonstrate so much more to a controller trainee, that, you know, the workload in a cockpit. We're getting people through that have just literally no idea of what goes on inside a plane, other than them going on holiday. And I think that's probably where the first point could change, and change quite simply. You know, the cost of one fan flight in a PA-28 or something, and then explain and actually use that as a training exercise, not just go away and do it and come back, but actually teach from that. Consider how much this workload was there for one person in a little plane versus a complex aircraft like a 320.
I think following on from what Emma, then Andy and Mark have said, I mean, it sounds absurd, really, that given the size of air traffic budgets and airline training budgets, that you know, that the cost of air passenger duty or funding roster release for a true stay is actually what's getting in the way. And it seems as though there's some work that GATCO and BALPA can do together, possibly at an upcoming parliamentary reception, for instance, to move beyond these obstacles, bearing in mind that there is both a safety impact and an efficiency impact, which will also impact the environmental aspect to get this sort of thing up and running. But I suppose on the cost-free end, in the interim, having possibly more frequent forums like this, or setting up our own sort of joint GATCO BALPA internal bulletin board or forum where people can continue to have this sort of online exchange of ideas would be useful.
Yes, but somewhere where people could just ask questions and then the first person to get to it could answer. Do you have recurrent training like pilots obviously do every 6 months in the air traffic control world? What sort of recurrent training do you have?
Yeah, so from an en route point of view, we do our annual truce, and that can be one of 3 things. So we either go into the simulator and you just simulate the various aircraft emergencies within your bit of airspace, or you do what's called the stack days, which is where I can't remember, something and aircrew, can't remember what it stands for now, but pilots actually come to Swanwick and we all sit around a table, kind of similar to this kind of forum, and we watch incident replays from an air traffic point of view. We ask aircrew sort of what was your, or what goes through your mind in this situation, how could it be dealt with differently, this type of thing. And then the other option, or what used to be an option, was going up into the simulator with the airlines, but that doesn't seem to be a thing anymore. But yeah, and that's annually. We have to do that as part of our license.
So the stack bit is the interesting bit, I think, because that's where you get to say, well, this is what we're doing from our point of view. Yeah. More of that would be really valuable, wouldn't it? Because it would be valuable from the pilot's point of view as well. Yeah,
so I think that if off the top of my head, the sim is a mandatory thing. Every 2 or every 3 years, you have to have completed an actual simulator exercise, because some people will literally go through their whole career and never spoken to an aircraft with an emergency before. Some people seem to be a magnet to them. They do flick and change between what is sort of required, but that seems to be the general gist of it.
And it's exactly the same requirement for us in the approach sectors. We don't seem to get many of the stack days. We still have to do a minimum of one of the simulator days practicing the emergencies. But we do see, obviously, because we're kind of the end of the funnel, we do see a lot more of the emergencies and urgencies that we've discussed. I would like to see more participation from pilots in the emergencies simulator side of things as well. We've had it in the past, and every single time the pilots walked away going, why haven't we done this before? Why can't we do this more often? And it just seems that there's a will from the working levels, management levels seem to be somehow not communicating that across.
Oh, a good point to advertise joining BALPA if you're a pilot, and GATCO if you're a UK-based controller, and get involved in that. We definitely want to bring pilots and controllers together more for some training. I know it's definitely been floated in the past in Luton to invite the pilots to our emergency days. So we have the same, very, very similar to what happens in the control centre. We have simulator runs for emergencies. We do practice call-outs when it's very quiet traffic that we coordinate with the fire service that helps their training and our training. And it can be to the fire training ground where they can set up their fire appliances, or it can be, you know, practice to timings to the end of the runway or to the stand. And we do a bit of joint training with them. So getting pilots involved in that kind of thing would be excellent as well. I'm going to go back very briefly to something that was mentioned before about either side of the frequency understanding the restrictions and being able to comply with them. So Glenn, when you were talking about the giving the climbs, and Mark, I think it was, mentioned giving departures climb to by this climb, I can't remember the word now, the climb limit. So by this
level
point,
by.
Level by, thank
level
you.
By.
That's why you're the pilot and I'm just a tower controller. I don't deal with these things. We had a question through the email, which was, when given the speed restriction, what is pilots' understanding of how quickly and accurately they should be complying with this? And are there any specific scenarios where it isn't possible? And for the controller side, how quickly do you expect pilots to slow down or speed up if that's the requirement? And what issues does it cause if they don't comply with the speed restrictions within what you expect time frame?
I'll go first from a pilot perspective then. So on the climb restrictions for aircraft types that do, first of all, a derated takeoff and then a derated climb, taking it all the way back to pre-departure, you know, if you're told on the data link clearance or as soon as possible on CPDLC that this climb restriction is needed, then you can plan a different takeoff profile. You can plan to use full climb as opposed to an initial derated climb and have a better chance of meeting that that restriction. If it's something that is a nice to have from your end, but not absolutely necessary, then obviously we would want to, as pilots, continue with the cost-effective profile. But if we know that for us there would be a disadvantage in not complying, then that would incentivize us to, to alter the climb profile sooner rather than later. Finding out later on in the climb you're passing level 170 or something, and someone says, "Can you be level 350 at Trent?" It may be that it's already too late for the aircraft weight and environmental conditions, and so that's just lost. Conversely, on the descent, there may be times when, based on having your icing services on, or just our speed and altitude and what the winds are doing, we cannot both make the level and the speed constraint that are assigned. And I think for pilots, we need to feel empowered to speak up early to say, look, is it okay to go down then slow down, or do you want us to go down, slow down then go down? And if there is one of the two that's not achievable, which is it for you? And then that raises your awareness earlier on, and then you can say to us, well, look, forget the level restriction, just get the speed back. This is for in-trail spacing to wherever, or conversely, sort out the level and then, and then reduce the speed after that. But again, just having the exchange and feeling empowered to speak up allows us to get to a shared mental model earlier on.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, I always used to ask, but it's the level by coming south from Scotland. There's a level by, I can't remember the waypoint now, but you needed to be below 190 or at or below 190 by a certain point. And actually sometimes that would be really difficult without, deploying full speed brake and all the rest of it, which actually then makes it very uncomfortable for the passengers as well. So you wouldn't want to do that if there was already turbulence around, which you might not know. And I never, ever had a situation where I said to the controller, what do you need most? And they came back to me and said, no, you must do both of these things. It really is a two-way, we're a team. It's not just the pilots that get the aircraft around the country or around the world. It's the team it's a support network, isn't it? So, without you, we can't go anywhere. So, I just found that always asking those things. I'm really curious to know about the speed restrictions though, because and how quickly you expect them to be complied with, because we all know there are some airlines that maybe don't always comply with those restrictions straight away and are repeatedly having to be asked to slow down or speed up, depending on which the airline is. And I'm just, whenever I was told a speed constraint, I would just come back to it straight away. Is that what you're expecting, or do you expect that it's going to take us 10 miles or 20 miles to reach that?
So as an approach controller, I use speeds a lot. And that's how we maintain our spacing. So we vector to achieve the spacing and then speed to maintain. If that speed compliance isn't, I would say, done in a fairly positive way, it can make a big difference to either losing a departure slot, or we're now being told that rather than lose a departure slot, send the aircraft round.
Wow.
And that's driven from the airport.
Yeah.
But if it's non-compliance of speed, which should be penalised, the aircraft on the ground that's done nothing wrong, or the aircraft that's not flown the speed restrictions correctly?
Yeah.
Is there a figure that you can throw out, Mark? Something like, 5 knots per second, 10 knots every 2 seconds in terms of the rate of deceleration that we should be achieving?
Oh, now that's quite a complicated scenario. There are, for levels, there's definitely a minimum descent rate.
Yeah.
I've never heard of anything for speed reduction.
There are some sectors overseas that abroad that would actually have, sort of published AIP parameters, but just as a generalization, as sort of good custom and practice. I mean, you're seeing what's going on the Mode S as much as we're sitting there thinking, well, I've been told to go from 180 to 160, and so doing it over 10 seconds, 15 seconds seems excessive. Expecting it done in 3 seconds, also seems a bit much. So what's sort of the middle ground feel that you would expect? Me personally, flying, I tend to think that, if we're doing a 10 knot reduction every 2 seconds, even if that involves using speed brake, then that's reasonable. But what feels like the right ballpark to you?
Okay, so
just putting in.
Sorry, Andy. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, Andy.
I was going to say I did try. I saw this question last night, and I did try and look, because I've definitely read somewhere that we expect it's 1 knot per second roughly is this the rate of change that we're expecting. Okay. But obviously, if that's not achievable, whatever, like, we just let us know. But I am trying to find that reference, but I've definitely read somewhere that we're expecting, or it should be 1 knot per second is the rate of change.
And actually, if you reduce speed by 1 knot per second and you're flying a constant descent approach, which is obviously what you're expecting us to fly now, I always used to find, because other wiser captains taught me when I was a first officer, if you bleed the speed back slowly, it literally every second just wind it back by a knot, you can maintain your descent rate, and it doesn't really make much of a difference. Whereas if you just bang the speed back from 180 to 160, for example, the aircraft will prioritize the speed and start to level out to slow you down. So, there's some tricks that we can use to try and make that a little bit more polished. Either way will achieve the same result, but there are ways we can do that. And the other thing, of course, is I always used to prefer slowing down to going in the hold. I'd much rather fly slower than go round and round in circles for 15 minutes. So
yeah, so we do try and do that now. So whenever delays are 6 minutes or more for all of the holds, we're supposed to bring, well, certainly Gatwick and Heathrow, we bring the speed back to 250 knots, and we try and help you absorb that delay in a linear fashion, which is quite often why you'll hear that. And going back to level by restriction, so generally if you're on your own and you get told the speed and a level, would rather you made the level, because then we don't need to coordinate that, and then you can bring the speed back. But if you're being streamed, if you're being sequenced, then we'd much rather you made the speed compliance, because quite often, like on a higher level sector, the aircraft are generally further apart, because there will always be a slight catch up due to the back one being a little bit higher, even on the same speed. But on the lower level sectors, like coming into Stansted from the east, from Maastricht, quite often we're packing you in 6 Mile and Trail, given to the next terminal control sector. And we expect, if we say 270 knots, we literally need 270 knots. There's no sort of tolerance, unless you tell us you can't maintain it. When there is actually no tolerance, is the same way we clear you to a flight level. You wouldn't climb the flight level 375 if we asked for 370, for example.
Coming into that from the tower perspective, I would say that we're, as far as I'm aware, we would never send an aircraft around to get a departure away unless the departure was already on the runway, or potentially if it was a CAT-A hospital flight. If it's a passenger jet or a cargo jet, we're not going to line it up if we know the gap is too tight. But if we come to you and say minimum safe approach speed, it's generally because if you don't reduce, you're going around even without that departure because you're too close to the one in front. Generally we would say, no, well, this gap's not going to work, so the departure can go in the next gap. If the next gap doesn't work, it goes in the next gap. And if the next gap doesn't work, that's when we're on the phone to radar to say, okay, instead of 6 mile gaps, can you give me 8 mile gaps, please? Because I need to get some of these planes out. But if it's the tower that's giving you the speed restriction we don't give speed restrictions other than asking for minimum safe approach speed. And that's generally because a 4 mile gap that was enough to get 2 arrivals in has suddenly become a 3 and a hair mile gap. And if we can't use land after, then the second plane is going around. So yeah, please comply with that as best and quickly as you can.
And I have been at Gatwick probably more than Luton, but there have been times when I've literally been sitting there thinking we're gonna have to go around off this. We're gonna have to, and they'll start to read the call sign, and they'll say, you know, very slowly start to read the call sign so they can get wheels off before they give us the landing clearance. And that can get quite. You can start to get quite sort of, yeah, shit. This is gonna be a go around. So
yeah,
sometimes
in
it's
that
quite
kind
close.
of scenario, if it's good visibility, we'll give you information. We'll tell you why we're asking for the reduction. We'll say,
Yeah.
you know, reduce to minimum safe approach speed. You're currently 3.2 miles behind Cessna 172 to 90 knots, and then the pilot goes, "Oh, okay."
I think what Olivia's just said there is the key, really, you know, on to the theoretical of do we do 1 knot per second or more on the deceleration, for instance, in trail. If you were told to reduce speed and spacing behind an A380, etc., then suddenly there's an incentive for you to do a lot better than 1 knot per second. Or likewise, minimum approach speed for a departure that's on the runway. Again, your situational awareness is raised, that there's something in it for you to, you know, to maximize drag and get it done, rather than to think about the most efficient profile. So situational awareness is obviously key to contextualize what you know, what's needed.
We've got a few questions in from spectators or participants that I want to go through. So they're not exactly related to speed control, but they are kind of related to a similar kind of expectation, shall we say. So there's a comment from Nigel DeBook, apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. The best and most helpful response to asking for example, an alternative missed approach routing due weather, but it could also apply for speed restrictions for any sorts of climbs, is climb to 5,000 feet, go anywhere, just tell us. So obviously not going to work in the London TMA, but in quieter airspace, how helpful is that kind of thing? So if I need to get you as a tower controller, for example, for weather avoiding, I know that you can go north. How helpful is it from a controller perspective to offer the pilot, you know, if you can do this, you can do whatever you want. So if you can turn right and go north, you can have this spectrum of possibilities. And how helpful is it for, specifically for approach controllers where it's getting the aircraft in? How helpful is it if a pilot says to you, you know, I need to turn heading 270, but I can accept any altitude, or conversely, I need to go to flight level X. I can take any headings between these. How helpful is that to workload? Does that complicate things because then you're having to factor all that choice in, or does that help because then you've got, rather than having what do I do, you've got an option of what to do?
There's definitely two sides to that. If I can go straight to base leg and go straight in when you're number 7 or 8 in the queue isn't necessarily the best option, because that would have been the same for everyone. However, to know I can take any turn to the left, but I definitely can't turn to the right because the cell's there, that makes a big difference. You know, you're not going between 2 cells or going for the path of least build-up. That really helps us build a bunch of what we can and can't do. Things like it's being said, if I can get down lower, I can get underneath the weather and around that way. That makes a big difference as well. So we can prioritize descent rather than the speed restrictions and things. But yeah, there are times when too much information also is not appropriate. So a balanced amount of that can be really helpful.
Same in the flight deck, actually. I mean, the most helpful thing really is if there's particularly weather related, is to be told, turn until you're avoiding the weather and then tell us what the heading is, and keep a good climb or something. You know, that's really, really helpful because it's not giving us too much choice. It's literally, we'll try and follow our routing as much as possible, but it's giving us a little bit of autonomy to be able to get round, you know, what might actually just be an isolated cell that you can avoid really easily. And it really does help. And I agree with as little information, as possible, because you usually, in those situations, you're going to be busy and we're going to be busy, and that level of freedom means that it gives us two options, particularly if we're in CPDLC airspace, where we could just text you the heading we're on, potentially, or we can just get a quick heading in really quickly without sort of having to explain it all. It takes a lot of workload off.
There's Gatwick and Thames, the sectors have a lot of airspace. Within that, there are constraints and there are some inflexibilities, but there's a lot more flexibility there than there is Heathrow, because they're just boxed in all the way around by other sectors. We're very fortunate in the fact we've got that space. So we try and teach, and it's definitely been a change to this method, you can turn left when you're steady on the heading, report the heading, or we can get you descent now, but the further descent will take you outside controlled airspace and discuss. I've had pilots say, no, we want to take descent to get out of this weather. They're happy to leave controlled airspace. And it depends on obviously the severity of the weather.
I mean, for us, the highest workload would be during a go-around, for instance, and so any simplification to a complex go-around procedure would be beneficial. So that the typical examples that come to mind would be Newcastle, perhaps Leeds, where you're leveling off at a low altitude, possibly still in an area of wind shear, if that was the reason for the go around, with a complex turn back overhead the field, and something that just goes straight ahead to a higher altitude, reduces workload substantially for the pilots. And so it's something that I guess with experience, you can ask for, and that the traffic picture would typically accommodate on your end. And so just raising the awareness that the option is available would be useful.
And then going back to specifically to climbing and descending, we've got a question from Toby for the controllers. It says, we're cleared to descend flight level 220 by Rennes. Before we reach Rennes, are we cleared to descend? Excuse me, I'll start again. Before we reach Rennes, we're cleared to descend flight level 180 by Edesi. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing these properly. I don't know these points. Am I right in thinking that this effectively cancels the flight level 220 restriction unless reiterated by the controller? Yep,
so they're absolutely spot on. However, the descent profile should roughly keep you on the IDICE. The 180 level IDICE should roughly be 220 at Rennes anyway. You should only, depending on your speed, you'll only be 500 feet to 1,000 feet out max. But yeah, unless it's been reiterated by the controller, the previous restriction no longer applies. I know some people tend to do it just out of good practice, tend to stick with it, but to be honest, if you're out by a couple of 100 feet, we wouldn't really, it needs to be reiterated ultimately. So yeah, it wouldn't have that much of an effect, so to speak.
Okay, and then we're going back very briefly to the cooperation point that we were talking about before the training. We've got a two-part question from Russell McDonald. We're going to address the first part. I'll keep the second part for the end of the conversation. He says, I'm a newly qualified Airbus 320 TRI with 7 years commercial operation out of Heathrow. One of the challenges I'm facing is creating a realistic ATC environment. It's not easy being a controller for the trainees, especially when non-normal scenarios unfold. So how do you think we can address that? The same for us when we're in the simulator. It's not easy to recreate. You have one, maybe two, I don't know, maybe in Heathrow where there are a lot more people, they have 3 or 4 pseudo pilots, but in the end, we're not pilots, so we can drive the little blips around on the screen and we can do our best to pretend to come up with the requests that pilots ask, but it's not a realistic scenario. How can we make these things more realistic to help train the new generations?
So from area control, we do encourage, like on the stack days sometimes, on our simulator days, we do try and get pilot volunteers to come in. I can find out the email and I'll get it sent, but there is an email you can email, and someone at Swanwick that deals with all of our truce they will send you like the information for join instructions. Will give you a series of dates where you'd be welcome to come in and watch us use the simulator and even plug in with the pseudo pilots. We have some pretty good pseudo pilots, but again, a lot of them, quite a lot were made redundant with the pandemic. So quite a lot of them are new. They're just doing, you know, a very scripted kind of thing. But some of the older, more experienced ones, they know kind of roughly what you guys do, and that's thanks to some of you guys that have been in and given guidance to these people.
And from our perspective, when we're doing the emergency training, we have to say to the pseudo pilots to not always respond, to add in the realism of you can't communicate with us at the moment, we're busy, that sort of thing. So I would suggest that probably the biggest thing you could add in for realism would be sorry, I couldn't talk to you then, I was on the phone. Because we do make a very large number of phone calls, especially around emergency and urgency aircraft. You know, there are so many people that we need to tell to make sure that there's things prepped and ready, that, yeah, don't be straight in with the responses that they're expecting to hear.
You should get me down to just, because I know what I'm doing in an aircraft, but if you want someone to be just a little bit rubbish, then I'm your woman. You know, I can completely mess things up for you if you need some training help.
I think to Russell's question, the difficulty is creating realistic use of distractions would sort of be the heading. So in the simulator, you know, we do our internal fly, navigate, communicate piece. We do our technical management around the issue, and in the simulator, it feels that whenever you're ready to speak to air traffic control is ready to listen to you. Whereas in the real world, that's not the case at all. And then additionally, air traffic control in the real world would be throwing in all these meaning to be helpful questions that, you know, that may be unhelpful distractions, but they may be based on a regulatory need. And so in some airspace sectors, for instance, even just saying minimum fuel, immediately they start asking you 10 questions about endurance and, you know, what are your plans and this and that and the other, which are very distracting for us because we're still trying to develop our decision-making process. But this is the real world, and it's so difficult to not create negative learning in the simulator on the technical bits that Russell as the instructor is trying to see, but are distractions that realistically arise. And so I don't envy Russell sitting there in the simulator, not trying to create a negative learning environment, but at the same time an appropriate level of distraction that simulates the real world. I don't think there is a right answer, is the long and short of it. So
it's very difficult. And as we were saying before, having pilots in the control center, in the ops room, or in the VCR in the tower, or having controllers in the cockpit is great. But as soon as any abnormal situation starts, then the extra baggage is very swiftly ejected, so it doesn't become a distraction. So you never see live how the other sides deal with it.
In an ideal world with no money restrictions, you would have a setup, wouldn't you, where you'd have real cabin crew in a simulator with real pilots and real air traffic controllers, and you'd all work together. And actually that's what they do in the Air Force. They actually have, when they do their emergency training, they actually do, certainly on the multi-engine aircraft, then that's what they do. But yeah, maybe
I think Emma's hit the point on cost. Because certainly you can get simulators with the fidelity to create at least background air traffic control conversation that the instructor can then cut into when it's time to give the specific trainee an instruction. But again, that sort of fancy level of simulator costs money, and airlines are not willing to invest, which goes back to Emma's point. So.
Okay, I want to dedicate the last part of the seminar to a bit more to abnormal situations, emergencies. So we've just got a couple of questions related to departures and arrivals. So one of the questions through the email, I'm going to give you them both together and you can answer both together or one of them separately, whichever your preference. Question through the email was, why are so many departure, so many SIDS and so many stars renamed, but they seem to be basically the same. Is that to do with different ground-based aids, or why is that? And then a question from the audience, from Steph Byrne, who asks, I always wonder why you don't just give us the actual SIDS and stars to fly all the way onto the approach. And if they don't work, why don't we design them better and work together? As manual headings all over Europe on busy frequencies is getting far too much.
Okay. The second one I can add into the if it was quiet and the SIDS and stars did all the way onto approach, then yes, it's a doable thing, and they are looking at doing full PRNAV routes into a lot more airports. In fact, London City has a full PRNAV route. We invariably then shortcut that PRNAV route by going further down, because it's a 55-mile long route, east to west, and there are definitely points we can make significant shortcuts on when it's quiet. But to achieve spacing is really difficult with that. We're spacing at 55 miles and descent through about 10,000 feet, and the wind variables and weather variables in that mean that the spacing we do at 55 miles may not be what we need to achieve for the airport. If it's too small, we end up vectoring everything to re-achieve the spacing, and the workload can rapidly change. Whereas at Gatwick, where from the holes we vector all the way in, the ability to achieve accurate spacing is only done by vectoring. If everyone's doing different profiles, different speeds at different times, and different rates of change, then once again you get the really inaccurate, inefficient runway usage.
And just going back to SIDS and stars, so a lot of the stars have been renamed for coming into London TMA from an en route point of view. Apparently it's to align with ICAO, so previously you had the Lamborn 3 Alpha, it's now the Logan 2 Hotel. So it's all to do with where the aircraft commences the standard arrival, even though obviously the Stansted ones tend to have a little bit lower down, but they tend to start on the FAR boundary. The SIDS, I believe, they were truncated to align with where the aircraft roughly gets climbed by air traffic anyway. So, for example, the Heathrow, I think it was the old Heathrow Dover SIDS, you'd usually get climb from 6,000 feet about 20 miles before Dover. So basically, they've just created they looked through loads of statistics and they found that X percentage of aircraft were getting climbed 20 miles before Dover or wherever it was. And they decided to create a fix at that point there, which is where the SID would end, and it would help you guys save X amount of kilograms per flight in fuel uplift. So that's why a lot of the SIDs have been redone. And also with regards to stars as well, they're creating a lot of on-nav routes now, which are 7 mile apart. And it basically means in an en-route environment, we don't need to use headings to provide lateral separation. And it just naturally splits up the traffic anyway. So on Clacton that I do, aircraft come in from Maastricht route into these points, and the Stansted and Luton inbounds automatically go down one track. Amsterdam outbounds come down one track. The Heathrow inbounds go down a certain track. And then the Gatwick inbounds go down a certain track in London cities. And it effectively just naturally splits up the traffic, whereas previously we'd have everything on radar headings to separate. And that's why a lot of the routes and stars have been changed, well, changed by name, but they are roughly the same, or roughly where you'd be radar vectored anyway.
Yeah, so it's formalising what was previously done by vectors.
Essentially, yeah.
And we have an additional comment to that from Adam Exley, who is another one of our controllers here, who said that if you're operating into busy airports, operating an efficient runway can result in some aircraft being required to fly non-optimal profiles. It's always for the greater good, as an efficient landing order or departure order benefits everyone. So it might be the case that you're taken slightly off the star because, as has been mentioned already, the catch-up rate is such that if you continue to fly at standard, then you're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time to land. Okay, for the last 25 minutes that we have left of the session, I want to start looking a little bit more at abnormal situations. So the second part of the question that we had from Russell MacDonald was, in the London TMA under Heathrow Director's control, what can an aircraft expect from ATC when on a mayday? And if under a fuel mayday, does anything change from the ATC perspective? So Emma touched on this briefly before when she talked about emergency situations, not knowing whether it's a medical emergency or the dual hydraulic failure. For pilots, what can they expect from ATC when they declare mayday?
Okay, I don't do the Heathrow sector. I did train on it for a little while. An emergency is an emergency, and that's how it's taught throughout our room. It doesn't matter whether it's a fuel emergency or the aircraft structural issues or whatever. They're given the same priority, but we expect the pilots to kind of help us understand their urgency, whether their urgency is to hold and go through all the books to make sure they're ready to make an approach, or whether they need to get on the ground immediately. There's only two people that can communicate that to us, and well, as soon as we've got that information, we can then make the plan. If it's get on the ground immediately, everything's out the way. If it's hold, we've got planned from our training where's best for you to go to achieve that. Gatwick and Thames radar, there's some big areas where we can do long legs rather than having to put you into a hold. But sometimes the pilots ask for a hold because I get the feeling they feel they can just let the machine get on and fly the whole pattern for them whilst they're doing other work, rather than having to have instructions to do vectors. So yeah, it's a conversation as to what is required.
Yeah, and we'd certainly always tell you as soon as we could. I think the initial thing is to let you know that we're not a normal flight anymore, and then once we've dealt with whatever it is, from a flying point of view, of course, then we tell you exactly what's going on. Because it might be as well that the airport we're flying into might no longer be an option because it might be too short for us to land, or any number of things could have changed. And one of the things that we used to do in the sim actually was coming into London, they would deliberately give you a failure that would mean you'd need a really, really long runway to try and get you to think out of the box about where you're going to go. And one of the options was always, well, closing Heathrow is still better than crashing. So, and it would be an absolute nightmare to have to do that. But actually, if you did have to do that, you've got to do what is what you've got to do to get on the ground, haven't you? So, obviously, that would be something that most people would avoid at all costs. But it's still, at the end of the day, from our point of view, we've got to look at where is the best landing place for us. It doesn't matter if it's not an airport we normally operate into. We've got to go, what's the longest bit of tarmac that we can get ourselves down onto?
Just to follow up the end of Russell's question, which is about the fuel mayday specifically, you'd like to think that this is following up on a previous minimum fuel call rather than fuel mayday out of the blue. But either way, someone says fuel mayday, they're sitting in, let's say, one of the holding patterns for the London airport into which they're flying. How quickly then can you remove others from the way, hopefully, and get that aircraft onto an approach?
It builds our complexity massively, but there's nothing to say we can't almost put you straight at the airport. But so the holds, certain holds, if you're depending which levels you're at, there's no way you could go straight to the airport and make a stable approach. Because the other factor we do consider is getting you in a position where the approach is stable, because the worst thing you want to do is be unstable and have to go around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is definitely something that is taught and retaught, and it's every time I actually examine our ART truce scenarios as well, and it is always on our list of how we handle fuel emergencies, minimum fuel scenarios, and the fact that racing an aircraft into an approach situation isn't necessarily what is required. It's getting to a point where they can create a stable approach and get on the ground safely. So that is absolutely driven into us as a factor.
And a question for the pilots here. You may or may not be able to answer this question, but Gareth Richardson says that one of the biggest things pilots can help us as controllers with during an emergency situation is just tell us exactly what's wrong and how it impacts your aircraft. He says there often seems to be a reluctance to tell controllers what the problem is. So you get aircraft that declare an emergency for a small technical issue, but they will not give you any specific details on what that issue is. Is there any reasoning behind this reluctance? Is it a pilot-to-pilot thing? Is it a company thing? Is it an aircraft type thing? Why don't they tell us?
There's potentially a I want to get home from my wife thing going on there. Certainly, I've only ever worked for one airline, and I was never under the impression that I couldn't just be completely honest about what was going on my aircraft. So I wouldn't ever declare an emergency and not be willing to divulge why. I might not want to, there might be some things that there's no point explaining to you because it would take longer to explain than getting the aircraft on the ground. But if I need your help, then I'm going to tell you why I need your help and what's going on so that you can kind of understand, because obviously a fumes event, for example, is a very different scenario than a sort of hydraulic failure or a medical emergency. And they do it does matter because of the sort of help I might need when I get into wherever you send me. So, I think that certainly from my point of view, and as I say, I've only ever worked for one airline, there was never an issue with telling you why there was an emergency and why I needed to be a priority, or declaring a pan, of course, which I'd still do the same thing. I'd still give you as much information as possible. I do know people who have always wanted to be a little bit more covert about things, and I'm like, I really don't understand why, because you're going to have to fill it all in an ASR anyway, and if you can refer back to tapes if necessary, then that's even better.
From a personal perspective, I always got the impression that lots of people listen to the radio. It's not just pilots and controllers. There's emergency services, there's airport people, there's the airlines, there's the handling companies, and there are also aficionados, spotters, who've got a little handheld radio and listening in. Is there a perception among pilots that they don't necessarily want to share this information with all those people? In a lot of countries as well, the recordings are available online. That might have something to do with it.
Yeah, correct. Just to follow up on the general motivations piece, which does tie into the modern phenomenon of liveatc.net, covering Heathrow as much as JFK, San Francisco, whatever you say, it's on the internet for perpetuity. And having worked for a number of different airlines, I think the individual pilot's understanding of the company culture, how much of it is a blame culture, what do we mean by just culture, how much is an open culture, does play into how people share on the radio, as well as the fact that the understanding of the actual emergency may not be full. So we may intuit at the time that declaring an emergency is appropriate, which we may then wish to subsequently downgrade or not, as the case may be. But we're still going through our ICAS or our ECAM or whatever diagnostic process we're into. And so when you ask, Olivia, as the controller, well, what is the problem here? Quite frankly, what we should say is I don't fully know the extent of the problem, but I know it has something to do with flying controls and hydraulics. I may be able to improve the aircraft state following this troubleshooting and action process, or I may not. And so that's the general problem. Flight controls are degraded. I'll come back to you if the situation improves or if it gets worse, or if we can't do anything about it. And that's all I know for now. And it may well be, depending on the scenario, that declaring the emergency was precipitous somewhat. and then you've restored the aircraft to a state that leads you to think, well, actually, I can now continue this flight onward to destination, or perhaps to an en route maintenance base. And not everyone will have the confidence, having said, I have just declared an emergency, due to voicing what the actual technical problem is, to then feel confident that they can actually downgrade from an emergency to a PAN, or from a PAN to, you know what, we're just going to carry on now to destination. The problem is solved, which is why some may appear, as you say, more coy or covert or less confident. I think for me personally, as an industrial rep with BALPA, interacting with management a bit more, I would probably feel inherently more confident, speaking up openly, knowing that this doesn't create within my company's culture additional personal risk, but that isn't the case across the board. So all I can ask for on the controller end is patience. I mean, just to give one example, I was leaving Buenos Aires one evening on the 777. What was certainly a small technical problem, we chose to share with air traffic control what the small technical problem was. We resolved it. We were ready to continue taxiing for departure. And they said, well, now that you've told us you can't go anywhere and you need to get onto your company on the radio, file a full report with the AIS office, coordinate that, and then you can depart. And so they sort of lost us 30 minutes sitting on the taxiway. And it had to do with their local incident history and some things that had occurred. But it left us thinking, we probably should have just said to them, someone stood up in the cabin, solved our small technical problem, and carried on. Whereas with that same technical issue, as it were, had we shared that with the UK Air Traffic Control Centre, we wouldn't think there would be some prohibition on just continuing the flight. So the psychology can be complex, but generally well-meaning as a conclusion.
Definitely. And I would always err on the side of telling the truth. Personally, I would never felt that I was under threat from my airline. I have had incidents I've declared, some of them have been my fault, and I've just put my hands up and said, yeah, I got that wrong, or that happened and I could have done this differently, whatever. And I never had any, it was always a very positive learning culture from that. The one exception I would make with that would be if we had a terror threat of any sort. I wouldn't give you a lot of details about that over the radio, for exactly the reason that you don't actually need half of Essex to turn up at Stansted when you divert there. You don't need that to be. There are some situations like that where I'd probably be a bit more covert. But the only other thing would be, some technical problems that we have. Sometimes it's easier to just say to you, as Glenn said, this is an issue that affects my flight controls. This is an issue that affects my braking capability, rather than telling you exactly what that thing is, because I know my aircraft, but you don't, because you deal with hundreds of different aircraft types all the time. So sometimes there would be, I'd always tell the truth, but it might be kind of in crayon, so that you know why I'm declaring the emergency.
Yeah, I think that's what Gareth was getting at, is that when the emergency is definitely there, the right amount of information across, so that we can at least get the right preparation on the ground.
Yeah.
A galley fire is completely different to not being able to select more than 20 degrees of flap. Absolutely, as you put it in crayon, that's the best way of getting communication all the way down the line without losing some of the key information.
I find that with life, actually.
From a tower perspective as well. So an electrical issue can affect your aircraft, but it's unlikely to leave the runway contaminated. So if you're able to land and vacate, then a cursory runway inspection is probably going to be enough to allow us to continue operations. Whereas a full hydraulic failure might leave the runway covered in hydraulic liquid, in which case it's unusable for a while until we get it cleaned.
Luckily, that's something you're never going to have to worry about at Luton, because it's too short.
Okay, for the last 10 minutes of the session, I want to look at a more specific scenario and see how this same scenario would be dealt with on either side of the frequency. So last year we looked very in depth at go-arounds. This year, what we want to look at is an explosive decompression. So aircraft suffers an explosive decompression, first of all, from the pilots. What are the steps that you take? What's a kind of basic run through of the scenario from your point of view?
Okay, Emma's pausing, so I'll go first.
Yeah, you go first.
Well, so first we need to keep ourselves alive. So in the case of an explosive decompression, we need to get our oxygen masks on. We need to re-establish communication with each other, ensure that we're flying the aircraft through doing all this, that somebody does indeed have control of the aircraft. And then we have memory items to commence a descent. So without being type specific, it may involve one pilot initiating a descent profile. Obviously, we have ability to see what's going on TCAS, so we may intuit whether that means we need to start a turn or not, depending on where we are, and possibly in this assignment or splitting of tasks, the other pilot may select 7700 on the transponder, manually deploy oxygen masks, if not automatically done, seatbelt signs, etc. So there's sort of this busy phase in the aviate, navigate, communicate, which at some point then involves, putting out a mayday call. From what I understand, and it's not a type that have flown, but I think the A350, for instance, will do some additional fancy things about commencing a profile itself and putting out warnings, etc. But I'd need an A350 person to validate that. So we may be doing a fair few things before we actually say to you that that we're into a descent and this is why. So it may well be from the controller's perspective that a descent has commenced and a turn has been initiated before 7700 pops up, and an explanation from the flight crew as to what's going on.
So the biggest thing as well with that, from our point of view, in terms of workload, is being on oxygen masks, because as much as it's fun in the sim to sound like Darth Vader, it's actually not. It would be a horrible situation to be in for real. And even in the sim practicing this, the sims are real enough. I've actually felt quite, my blood's been up when I've come out of a scenario like that, because you sit there and you think, I have to get this thing down, otherwise people are going to run out of air. And it's probably one of the worst things that can happen. So we're very stressed. We've got oxygen masks on, which means that it's really difficult for us to communicate with each other, because whereas ordinarily our mics and headsets will just work together, when to talk to each other with an oxygen mask on, you have to keep pressing the push to talk button, because otherwise you're just breathing in each other's ears all the time. So that instantly adds workload. And of course, the other thing is there are a lot of very inexperienced FOs around, particularly at the moment. In fact, everybody's sort of comfort zone has shrunk a little bit, because not so much now, but coming back after the pandemic, people hadn't flown for such a long time. So we're in a situation where we're not frightened, because we're trained to deal with it. It's part of our training, but your blood's up because something is seriously wrong with your aircraft. And it can still fly, so you can get it onto the ground, but you have got to get that aircraft down. And if you're if that happened overhead London, for example, that you're going to be descending into very, very busy airspace. So making an initial turn, as Glenn said, would be to do terrain, or if you did know there was an airway, you'd turn off it, and that's part of the procedure. And there's another part of the procedure, certainly on the A320, as part of the automatic flow of movements, while one pilot is descending the aircraft and getting all of that going on, the other pilot is doing a set of procedures that will start to close some gaps in the aircraft, try and reduce the loss of air out of the cabin. Of course, if there's an explosive decompression and a window's gone or something, that's not going to make any difference. But of course, as well, the reason we practice it in the sim is because it doesn't happen very often. So it's something we have to be ready for. But the workload is very, very high, and trying to tell air traffic what's happening and what you need you know, people will sound stressed.
Just to add to Emma's points there, obviously and I've just had a DM pop up from a colleague here who is one of our captains who, funny enough, was a controller previously. So with the explosive decompression, we can practice it as often as we like in the sim. What we cannot simulate is the startle effect and how individuals respond to startle. And so startle may feel like a fraction of a second to the individual, but your end as the controller not knowing what's going on here, it could be 2 or 3 seconds. So so things will never go exactly as planned. And having done what we should be doing, as Emma describes, getting ourselves back on oxygen, etc., we may actually have popped eardrums. We may have lost control of bowel movements. The extreme cold of the airflow will be affecting how we perform. So it naturally will be more chaotic in the real world than is practiced in the simulator. And so as with any of these exercises, it's quite different in reality from what we may discuss at a truce or a stack day.
So what we need from air traffic control is often what we would get, which is a calm, measured response.
So for the controllers, and Glenn has already said that before you get any communication, you've obviously noticed that something has gone wrong because the aircraft has suddenly made a turn, it started to descend. What kind of preparations are you already doing when you notice something like that before you get the Mayday call, before you have a full situational awareness of what's going on?
So there are obviously different ways of communicating. 7700 is probably the best way of communicating. We don't need words, we don't need anything, just that pushes through all our filters. So on all our radars, that will come up. So the approach sectors, I think it does the same at some of the towers now as well.
An alarm as well.
Yeah, and so everyone suddenly is aware. It also means that we can then start communicating with our teams. You don't need to tell us anything. We can see there's something wrong.
Is that the same for all is that the same for 75, 76 and 77?
Yes.
I thought it might be.
It just comes up on our ATM in the tower anyway. It just comes up with the squawk code and it flashes in red and has an alarm.
Wow.
So Andy, I guess these scenarios are far more prevalent in the sectors that you do than myself, because I'm sort of 10,000 foot and below, really.
Yeah, so I haven't had an explosive decompression, but I've had, funny enough, just a few weeks ago, a Delta climbing out of Amsterdam. He checked in, I climbed in flight level 260. Next thing, his mode S changed to flight level 180. And in the meantime, I mean, it wasn't particularly busy, but he had went and listened to the readback and to the replay. And while I was transmitting to other aircraft, he was actually declaring a Mayday, and he wanted to descend to 10,000 feet and as soon as possible. But I didn't hear this, and it wasn't until his third call. In fact, it was only when I questioned, I said, "I'll confirm you're still climbing," and the next thing it was negative. We've got a decompression, and the first thing I said to him was, "Roger, like descend unrestricted, flight level 100, squawk 7700," because at the time he was still in Dutch airspace. He was outside my airspace, so technically it should have needed a coordinated descent. But the benefit of doing 7700, it would have overrode all the filters in Amsterdam. TC would have seen it, and it instantly everyone looks. And then as soon as the phone line, so my planner had to ring Amsterdam, and basically just they were ready to answer the phone straight away. They kind of knew what the phone call was going to be. This guy just took a rapid descent, went down to 100, asked him what his intentions were, and then I just sent him back to Amsterdam, and it was over as quick as that. And that was the benefit of doing the 7700. But the most interesting thing for me was I wasn't particularly busy, yet his call, I didn't hear it the first 2 times, whereas if he had have maybe selected 7700 before, or if I had have noticed the mode S maybe a little bit sooner, I might have been able to go and give my attention to him. But yeah, that was something I was quite surprised at, actually.
We've unfortunately run out of time for further questions. As always, the last 10 minutes is never enough, and we need another hour to continue the discussion. As a wrap up, I'd just like to say that if anybody who is watching has enjoyed this and wants to get more involved with GATCO or BALPA, please get in touch with us. We do have plans to work more and more closely in the future. So if you're interested in something along these lines, meeting up with other controllers, pilots, and discussing this kind of thing, we are setting up a new GATCO BALPA subgroup where we can coordinate a little bit more closely. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, improving interaction and knowledge sharing, then please get in touch with us, join us. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking part today. Thank you for everybody who has watched today. The link will be up online in the near future so that you can watch again. And please come to our next seminar next week, where we'll be looking at lessons learned, a review from CHIRP and AAIB. Thank you everybody again, and have a good day.